It is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce our last speaker of the morning, and a very distinguished speaker at that, former ambassador of Pakistan to the United States, Ambassador Husain Haqqani. Ambassador Haqqani is now a senior fellow and director for South and Central Asia at the Hudson Institute. He was Pakistan's ambassador to Washington from 2008 to 2011, and was previously, before that, Pakistan's ambassador to Sri Lanka in 1992 to 93. He has had a distinguished career in Pakistan's government, serving as advisor to 4 Pakistani prime ministers: Yusuf Raza Gilani, Benazir Bhutto, Nawaz Sharif, and Ghulam Mustafa Jatoi. He's the author of 4 books and is considered an expert on radical Islamist movements. He was previously director of the Center for International Relations and professor of the practice of international relations at Boston University, and is a graduate with his bachelor's and master's degrees in international relations from the University of Karachi. Additionally, I might remind those of you whose memories don't stretch back quite as far as mine, that Ambassador Haqqani addressed one of our very early ambassadors' roundtables at the Metropolitan Club when they were first created about a decade ago. So we're delighted to welcome Ambassador Haqqani back to speak to us today, a decade later. I'm sorry it's taken so long, but addressing the topic that's come up many times this morning, our embarrassing withdrawal from Afghanistan. So Husain, please join us and share with us your insights.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your very kind introduction and for remembering that I did speak to everyone about 10 years, I think it was 11 years ago. And it seems that the issues I spoke about haven't changed, except that the United States has pulled out of Afghanistan. And I am one of those who, I'm not a betting man, but if I were, I'd put $1 or $2 on the likelihood that the United States will find itself back in Afghanistan in a few years. The reason why I say that is that I think, and I had some of the discussion that you guys were having before I came on with Daniel Pletka, I think one of the best moments in US foreign policy after the Second World War was the period of the serious discussion about containment of the Soviet Union. And it all began with the long telegram of George Kennan. And what was the particularity of that long telegram? It actually explained what the United States needs to understand about the Soviet worldview. What do they think of themselves? What do they think of the world? And therefore, what can the US do to deal with that, because it actually is a threat to US interest. The US has not been able to do that successfully with either Afghanistan or Pakistan. What is the American interest there? Who are the real American allies there? And is there something other than just a transactional relationship that we can manage? And in that transactional relationship, Pakistan's elite, especially the Pakistani military, has done very well in working out arrangements with the Americans. It was a new country carved out of British India with virtually no resources, but a very large army. And they dangled that army in front of John Foster Dulles way back in the 50s and said, you need troops, we have troops. You need bases, we have territory from where you can spy on the Soviet Union. And so this thus began a relationship in which there was never any serious strategic commonality. Pakistan never gave troops for any of the anti-communist efforts of the United States, even after dangling them, but in the process built its own military capability primarily to confront India. And Pakistan believes that it is in an eternal competition with India. Afghanistan also was seen by Pakistan through the prism of India. It always worried about Indian influence in Afghanistan. Ironically, because of the history, because of the fact that a lot of territory of Pakistan is territory that until 1893 was part of Afghanistan, there are Afghans who have irredentist ideals, if not irredentist policies, and that feeds into this narrative. So when the United States went into Afghanistan after 9/11, the assumption of the Bush administration was that they had managed to coax, cajole, threaten, and incentivize Pakistan's then military dictator, General Musharraf, into supporting America's war, a global war on terror. Except that Musharraf writes in his own memoirs that he thought the Americans were coming only for a couple of years to do a cleaning up operation of Al-Qaeda. And so if you remember, he was very helpful at that time, and there were a lot of Al-Qaeda number 3s arrested. In fact, I think that was the most dangerous job to have in the world, because anybody who was considered the new Al-Qaeda number 3 was very readily handed over to the Americans to be brought to Guantanamo or to be taken to a black site somewhere by the Pakistani intelligence service. But Pakistanis were waiting for the American withdrawal, which they knew will come one day. And the Taliban had reconstituted themselves after coming out of Afghanistan in Pakistan. And so the saga of the remaining years is that the US stayed in Afghanistan for 20 years, and yet it never had a 20-year plan for Afghanistan. All it had were 21-year plans. And yes, the nation building operation became very big and ended up becoming the reason for a lot of people saying, oh, what are we doing there? Why are we there? And then an oversimplification stated first by Donald Trump in the words that, we're going to end forever wars, and by President Biden in the words that, well, if we are there just to protect the rights of Afghan women, well, we can't go to war everywhere where Afghan women are under threat. But basically, America never had a clear idea of what would victory look like. And 16 out of the 20 years America was in Afghanistan were spent discussing withdrawal. The Taliban used to have a maxim that the Americans have watches, we have the time. And basically, Americans reassured them virtually every year that yes, our watches are ticking, we are anxious to get out. And in the end, it was done in a very, very clumsy and very, very in my opinion, obnoxious manner. The Doha deal was a total diplomatic failure. Because if you read that agreement, the Taliban have promised nothing except two things. One is they promise to initiate. Again, the Taliban are very careful in language because they come from the Sunni Hanafi school, and therefore an agreement has to be interpreted only literally, and so the words of the agreement matter. So they said, we promise to initiate negotiations or discussions about peace with other Afghans. No commitment that we will actually bring those discussions to some conclusion. And the second is that we will not allow anybody to plot and plan terrorist attacks against the United States and its allies. And of course, clearly in those allies, the Afghan government, which at least in legal terms was the host of the American military presence in Afghanistan, was not considered an ally. So that was shameful in more ways than one. Dumping an ally like that completely in the negotiating process. Secondly, coming up with a deal in which basically you just surrendered just to be able to secure a withdrawal. And now the negotiator of that deal, Mr. Khalilzad, goes around saying, but of course, if there had been the Trump administration had remained, then they would have held them to account for their for their breach of the terms of the agreement. The truth is that was never going to happen. The political environment in America has reached a point where America is back in an isolationist phase. The right thinks that engaging with the rest of the world, the extreme right thinks that engaging with the rest of the world messes up America at home. The left thinks that America messes up the world by engaging with it. There are other issues that are more important. I don't know if anybody remembers Tom Friedman's piece, Fareed Zakaria's piece. These are liberal writers who all argued that getting out of Afghanistan makes sense because we are wasting time, energy, and resources there, which at that time, those resources and that energy should be devoted to dealing with China. But fact of the matter is that China is already heavily invested in Pakistan and is quite ready to move into Afghanistan if the circumstances are conducive to its influence there. We went in, the United States went in after 9/11 to deal with a failed state run by the Taliban, and we have left behind a failed state run by the Taliban. What went wrong in Afghanistan? Well, a lot of things, and we will have the postmortems for a long time, but let's just focus on the way America got out. Vietnam was the other place where a similar thing happened, a prolonged war, a division within American society about why we are not succeeding in any of our aims. People feeling that the pouring of money, American money, is creating a corrupt elite, and therefore that corruption is making the country more and more sort of a failure. At that time, if you remember, Henry Kissinger had that famous phrase that he negotiated with the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese so that there would be a decent interval between an agreement with them and an American withdrawal, and then the ultimate collapse of South Vietnam. In this case, Mr. Khalilzad failed to negotiate a decent interval. I will explain why that is. And I'll connect it to my earlier statement about Kennan having been a relatively smart man in terms of being able to tell us what the enemy thought. It is that we never understood, we never appreciated who or what the Taliban are. The Taliban are a totalitarian Islamist movement. They are not in the game for international recognition or legitimacy. Would they like some food aid? Yes. Would they like the unfreezing of their assets? Of course. But would they compromise what they consider to be basic elements of their faith, divine ordinations that they have to implement on other Muslims and the unbelievers who live in the territory they control? Certainly not. So not understanding that about the Taliban is the reason why the agreement with them failed to materialize in the form of a decent interval between American withdrawal and the Taliban taking over. The other mistake that was made in relation to the Taliban was not realizing that what they were saying to their own people is what they really meant to do. So I must have written dozens of op-eds on this in the last 2 years. Unfortunately, the bigger papers finally got tired because my first piece about not talking to the Taliban was published as far back as January or February 2013, an op-ed titled "Don't Talk to the Taliban" in the New York Times. And I've consistently argued that the Taliban, because of their belief system, do not consider any commitments they give to the unbelievers as absolutely binding. So therefore, they always use double entendre and they always use language that has other meanings. And that is what their agreement was going to be. And what they were telling the Amir of the Taliban, who, by the way, is a man who let his own son die in a suicide bombing. That is the level of his commitment. He was constantly saying, look, we didn't fight this jihad to get a few ministries in a power sharing arrangement. There will never be a power sharing arrangement. The emirate, which was taken away from us by the Americans by force, will be restored. Our faith system will be imposed and everything will be in accordance with Islam, which basically means in accordance with Islam as they interpreted it. So I failed to understand why the American negotiating team that negotiated this agreement, that went into talks with these people repeatedly, couldn't understand that at the end of the day, they were only willing to let the Americans leave. without too much bloodshed, because they thought that that may be a better option in terms of getting an American withdrawal. They were not discussing peace. There was no peace. There was no peace process. There was just a negotiation about the withdrawal process. The second part of it is Pakistan's role. I represented Pakistan. I've fought many a battle in Pakistan on policy issues, and I think now at this stage in my life, I have no qualms in saying that I lost most of them, and that's why I'm now living in the United States and not back home in Pakistan. But the fact of the matter is that it is very difficult to get the Pakistani elite to see the world through any other prism except India's. And in some cases, there are genuine security concerns, and in many cases, it is just paranoia. Instead of having a military that was raised to deal with threats that the country faced, Pakistan inherited a military and has therefore created threats that that justify the size of the military that it inherited. And so it's like people said about Prussia at one point that most countries have an army. The army has Prussia. And that's exactly the situation with Pakistan. So therefore, they were initially they were invested in the Taliban because, as I said, Musharraf thought that they will leave in 2 years. The Americans will leave in 2 years. Then they thought maybe another 2 years, another 2 years. And by the end, the Pakistani investment in the Taliban had become pretty deep. And secondly, no other Afghan group was willing to do business with Pakistan. And Pakistan, being a neighbor, could not afford to ignore Afghanistan completely. The Iranians, the Chinese, and the Russians all wanted the United States out. But now there is a difference of opinion about what each one wants. And I think we will have a prolonged period of multiple tracks going, a bit like, I don't know how many people in this audience have any recollection of the Cambodian peace process after the Khmer Rouge went on forever. The Japanese tried their hand, and there was an American-led process, then there was a European-led process, and the UN, etc., multiple arrangements, agreements, etc. And in the end, the Vietnamese marched in and imposed Hun Sen, who eventually ended up winning every election that has ever been held since then. So if somebody can march in and sort of force the Taliban's hand, then we will have some order in Afghanistan. As far as the original reason of America going in, dealing with the fallout of 9/11, dealing with a safe haven for Al-Qaeda, I think that has not ended. Everybody knows that. And anybody who says otherwise is only pretending. Some, of course, have pretended in a really odd way. I don't know how, if people remember Donald Trump describing his telephone call with Mullah Baradar and saying, I talked to him and he sounded like a statesman. And then, of course, President Biden going around saying things like, Afghanistan was never a unified country and we can't impose our values on anybody else. It's not a question of imposing any values. Afghanistan would have evolved at a natural pace if it had not been for the Soviet intervention and the war against the Soviets that totally disrupted that society. Almost 1/3 of that society, of that population had to take refuge in neighboring countries, Iran and Pakistan. The civil war after that, because there was nobody after the Soviet withdrawal who took any serious interest. Ambassador Peter Thompson, who was there from the US side, has written a very, I think, a slightly big book in terms of the number of words in it, because it's too detailed, but it has all the information about how after 1989 and the Soviet withdrawal, it was very difficult trying to figure out and create consensus, because once the state is disrupted, it's very difficult to recreate it. So state failure had already taken place. And the shortest duration that is needed for creating a viable state after a collapse like that has been described by various experts as in different terms, but the way I see it, it takes about 30 years for a second lieutenant to become a general. And so the Afghan army would have had some semblance of being a practical functioning force once one of its own had risen from the rank of second lieutenant all the way to general. And that didn't happen. You can't do that by changing trainers every 6 months, training programs every 6 months, every year, dividing it between countries. Okay, the Germans will train the police, the British will train the artillery, the Americans will train the infantry and the air and whatever small air force they have, etc., etc. That's no way to create an esprit de corps or creating a practical army. So the American experience and experiment in Afghanistan was a failure, not because America couldn't achieve its objectives, but because America didn't figure out and didn't pay sufficient attention as to how to achieve those objectives. First of all, clearly state them and then do that. And then it didn't understand who it was fighting, who it was dealing with. I think that in the end, Afghanistan will need however weak it might be, but it needs a government that actually recognizes international norms, recognizes international the international order, and sees it as something other than a means of getting some economic assistance from the international community, which is how the Taliban see the international order. The Taliban's commitment is that they will not let any plotting take place, but then on that subject, I don't know how we will hold them to account when they still say that they have not seen any evidence that bin Laden was involved with the 9/11 attacks. So when we do go to them with claims or assertions or evidence based on technical intelligence saying, hey, we know that some people sitting in Afghanistan are plotting an attack in Europe or in the United States or against the United States or on an American ship, etc. They will discount that and say, we can't be sure. You are not sure either that it is these people that you are accusing us of protecting. As far as protection is concerned, they have not said a word about not protecting fellow mujahideen as they see them. China, Pakistan are the two countries that are trying to play a greater role, will be able to do that. Pakistan has very close ties, especially with the Haqqani network, but also with the rest of the Taliban. Almost every major Taliban leader's family has been located in Pakistan. Pakistanis are flying around to all the various international meetings where they're invited in Pakistani military planes. No one else has the influence over the Taliban that Pakistan does. And then Pakistan maintains that its influence is not sufficient to make the Taliban change because of their very hardline, hardcore ideology. What is the takeaway? Well, first of all, I think we need to understand why America fails at counterinsurgency almost everywhere. I think that when you have a situation like the one we had in Afghanistan, maybe even the one in Vietnam, we need to understand that it's important to know what you want and who do you want to get it done through. And the American policy of the last 20 years seems to have gone from we respect Afghanistan's sovereignty, we've created a sovereign government there and let them make their decisions, to micromanaging that sovereign government's affairs, whether it's their elections, whether it's the internal politics, making people determining who should be a cabinet member, who should not, etc., etc. Even the constitution, instead of letting people negotiate, bargain, argue. So there's extensive involvement. Everybody complains about the military-industrial complex. I would say that in my experience and in the last 20 years, I've seen a lot in relation to Afghanistan from the United States. I think that it's not just the military-industrial complex. Now we also have an NGO complex in the United States. And then there is a peace, peace and stabilization complex. And I don't denigrate any of them, but I do think that each one of them pushes an agenda which sometimes gets the United States overextended as it did in Afghanistan. And then after that, everybody turns around and says, we've been here long enough, let's go. If there had been a 20-year plan, maybe we could have built something more than what we did. There's a civil society in Afghanistan, but there is no state. And that is the result of the NGO complex sort of getting too much into the weeds of policy making. So that was only for the cities. It never penetrated the rural areas. What can one foresee? Well, first of all, I think, contrary to what some people have written, there has been a dent in US prestige throughout the world as a result of both the impression that the United States lost in Afghanistan and had to leave, but also the way it left, the clumsiness of it all. Secondly, there is a humanitarian crisis to deal with in Afghanistan, but in that humanitarian crisis, I think lie the seeds of the next phase of extremist, radical Islamist jihadism all over the world. This is definitely not an enemy that is going to sort of come aboard an American aircraft carrier and surrender. And the fact, as Daniel Pletka was saying earlier, that a lot of people in the United States have neither any recollection of 9/11, nor do they think it was as significant as it was. It means that we will have to wait for something to happen again before we actually take a serious interest in the greater Middle East or the Islamic world as a whole. Central Asia is particularly worried because Afghanistan affects them immediately. And the Taliban are working right now only on trying to play up the humanitarian crisis to try and get some international assistance to be able to use that to create greater domination at home. They are totally unrepentant. They are totally unchanged. The notion of them having moderated their stance on certain things is absolutely wrong. Yes, there are certain districts and certain provinces where they are allowing women up to 8th grade to go to school. In other places, it's 5 or 6 grades, but that's about it. And that is basically only for now, while they are still trying to establish themselves. Once they have full control, and once they feel that their ability to feed the population and take care of basic necessities has been established, the Taliban will behave as they did before. And the international Islamist jihadi movement will start concentrating in Afghanistan. Pakistan is going to be the next one. We already see that in Pakistan, which thought that it has won a victory, is going to find that it's definitely a very Pyrrhic victory because the Pakistani Taliban have taken heart from the victory in Afghanistan. The government of Pakistan has signed or is on the verge of signing an agreement with the Pakistani Taliban, but that would again mean more concessions to them and a slow erosion of the Pakistani secular state that existed 30, 40, 50 years ago and has slowly lost more and more ground to Islamization. And so now we have a Shia theocracy in Iran that the United States has had lots of difficulty with, a Sunni theocracy in Afghanistan, and a nuclear-armed Sunni under pressure from theocracy state in Pakistan. I don't think that's a very good situation for the United States to have in South and Central Asia. But then there are people in Washington, D.C. who really cares. A former Secretary of State while discussing Afghanistan one-to-one with me not long ago had said, well, the fact of the matter is that nobody in my home state of Kansas really cares about what happens in Afghanistan. And those are the people I am answerable to. Eventually, I think that American foreign policy decisions about such places that people think are irrelevant and unimportant only come about when they become relevant in a very significant way. Afghanistan was not irrelevant on the eve of 9/11, but only after 9/11 was its importance and significance realized. I hope that nothing as bad as 9/11 happens anytime soon, but I will not be surprised if it does. So I'm going to stop here and let people come in with questions, because I'm sure there will be many. I fully understand the point of view of those who think that the withdrawal was necessary, but I think that the withdrawal, which was tantamount to surrender to the Taliban, was something that could have been avoided, and it was a total and utter failure of diplomacy that it happened the way it did.
Ambassador Haqqani, thank you very much for an extremely insightful presentation. We do have some questions from our audience, and so I'll call first on Ambassador Michael Desambre.
Ambassador, thank you very much for that. I thought that was very insightful, and I'm actually not going to ask a question about anything you said because I thought it was all very clear. I'll ask a question that related, though, to the fundamentalist belief of the Taliban that you said obviously should have been reflected in a negotiation with them. I'm curious your views on their perception of the Chinese and how the Xinjiang situation affects that and affects what they might think of doing against the Chinese or what they might think of cooperating with the Chinese.
So if you remember, the Taliban are essentially the second generation of the Mujahideen who fought the Soviet Union. And the Mujahideen had no qualms in taking American weapons to fight the Soviets. And in their own sort of literature that they published for themselves, etc., at that time, and for example, Osama bin Laden's mentor, Abdullah Azzam, who was sitting in Peshawar getting all these volunteers who were not Afghan or Pakistani to go fight in Afghanistan or to raise funds. He had published a book at that time. And the argument in that was very clear. We are only using one superpower to beat the other. And after that is beaten, we will turn on to the superpower from whom we are taking assistance right now. The point I'm making is that in their own theology, there is room to do that. They did it with the United States, took America's assistance to beat the Soviets. They will have no qualms in saying, okay, our brothers in Xinjiang are suffering for the moment, but right now we need China's help. Let's take it. And then eventually they will turn on China as well. Because I started reading Islamist literature, and I make a distinction. The reason why I use the term Islamist instead of Islamic is because Islamic is I am Islamic. Everybody who's Muslim is Islamic. But Islamist is people who think that Islam offers a political path for them and therefore should be the basis of their political struggle. And those groups have like the Marxists and their various offshoots always had a clear political plan, strategic plan, etc. They have one. And in that, the whole world has to be Islamized. So therefore, China will be on their, in their crosshairs, but not right now. Look at Pakistan. Pakistan's Islamist secretary, the biggest Islamist party in Pakistan actually has a bilateral agreement with the Communist Party of China. This is the Jamaat-e-Islami, which is the South Asian analog of the Muslim Brotherhood of the Middle East. And yet they have a bilateral party-to-party agreement with the Communist Party of China because they think that till America is cut down to size, we all need to work with whoever else we can work with. And China right now, as a rising superpower, is a good player to play with until we feel we can take on them.
Ambassador Tim Towle.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for a brilliant analysis of a very vital part of this world. And I see from your long biography here that you've written 4 books. That means you must be prosperous. And you've done op-eds, articles, publications, radio programs, and television. Are you not just sharing this wisdom with us? We're very important, as you can see. But are you going across the street to the White House? Are you talking to the United States National Security Council? Are you going across the river where there's nasty people from the CIA hang out? Are you going to the Defense Department? Are you going up to Capitol Hill that people tend to want to go to? Are you doing that, sir, so we all, or our children and grandchildren, can live in peace?
Well, the short answer to that is yes. Whoever would listen to me, I do speak to them, and I've testified before Congress. I've spoken to, and then every now and then they ask for advice. But let's be honest, the United States is a democracy. Its politics is essentially determined by public opinion at home. So, for example, on Afghanistan, all polling data seemed to indicate that the American public was done with Afghanistan. And so the political leaders always go by the by whichever direction the winds of public opinion are blowing. As far as the permanent state apparatus is concerned, it depends on political will as well. So are there people in the Central Intelligence Agency who are worried about what will happen? Absolutely. And, you know, there's a whole, I'm at a think tank. We all have relationships with each other. Everybody consults, writes. There's a lot of stuff that gets published and a lot of stuff that doesn't get published. It's all out there. But the problem is, if it is not on the agenda of the president or the leaders of the 2 parties in Congress, then it really is not going to become policy. All of you know that, because the wonderful people here who have served as ambassadors of the United States in many, many places, you all know very well. You only implement policy and you send your reports and your memos and et cetera, so that the policymakers will pay some attention. In the end, all that many of us, I just have a little anecdote to tell you. I mean, just before 9/11, I had drafted an op-ed that I had great difficulty in placing in any American newspaper, because it actually talked about bin Laden's recent speeches, just pre-9/11 speeches, in which he was talking about bringing down the towers of American arrogance. That, of course, the op-ed editor of a newspaper, of America's newspaper of record, was an old friend of mine. And he said, this is a bit too dismal and a bit too depressing. I don't think it's an immediate threat to you. Well, guess what? He called me 2 days after 9/11 and said, can you recycle that piece and make it up to date with the new lead about what has already happened? So the point being, we are, you know, I talk as an American now, we are a hopeful nation. We don't like people who are just giving depressing sort of analysis all the time.
Ambassador Todd Sedgwick.
Ambassador, thank you so much for a very illuminating talk you gave us this morning. There's been a lot written arguing that Pakistan has been playing kind of a double game, trying to be our partner on the war on terror. At the same time, the ISI allegedly is supporting the Taliban all along. Could you comment on that? And then secondly, you painted a very scary picture, in my opinion, about a theocratic, nuclear-armed regime in Pakistan. If you were advising the Secretary of State or the President, how should the United States mitigate that?
Well, for one thing, Pakistan, it's fashionable to say Pakistan played a double game. I don't think it played a double game. I think its game was very clear. It's just that Americans didn't want to acknowledge that that's what the game was. I mean, I had dozens. I was ambassador when Ambassador Richard Holbrooke was made special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. And he and I used to have these conversations. And I used to say, look, I'm from Pakistan, but I can tell you, Pakistan does not want you to stay in the United States, even though officially we are reluctant to say that. can I say this to you off the record? Let me just tell you, our army, our intelligence service is betting on the Taliban because they think the Taliban are ruthless enough to be able to actually walk in and take over Afghanistan. Do they want your assistance? Yes. Do they want your military equipment? Yes. Do they want dollars? Yes. Do they also want to help you in stopping Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda was also targeting Pakistan? Yes. Do they want to go after Pakistani jihadi groups who are attacking inside Pakistan? Definitely. But that does not mean that they are 100% on board with you on Afghanistan. And so therefore, you have to have clarity. Either find out what they want. Going back to my Kennan analogy, Kennan at least understood what Stalin wanted, what his obsessions were, what his paranoia was. There are too many nice American diplomats who go to Pakistan, who meet with our leaders, who find us, very comfortable speaking English, and come back thinking, these guys must want what we want them to want. Whereas that's not what they want. They want an upper hand in South Asia, in an environment in which India is 6 times larger than them in population, 20 times larger in economic terms. The only thing where there is parity is nuclear weapons. And so therefore, the subconventional warfare is a force multiplier for Pakistan in terms of its competition with India. If you understand that, then you don't see it as a double game, you understand it as their game.
Mr. Ambassador, let me ask a quick question of my own, and then also Governor Gilmore has a question. I don't see how you can say that Pakistan had a clear game and it was not a double game when the secret lair, if you would, of Osama bin Laden turns out to be within a stone's throw of the Pakistani military academy at Abbottabad. I mean,
so you obviously didn't catch the irony in my comment. I actually was not saying that there wasn't a double game in that sense. What I was saying was that Americans made the huge mistake of never trying to understand it.
Okay.
See, basically,
actually, no, I don't see. Say that again.
The Americans never look. The Bush administration kept on calling General Musharraf a great ally. I was here in exile at that time at Boston University. I wrote many times that Musharraf is not your ally the way you think he's your ally. He's only an ally in terms of receiving certain things from you in return for doing certain things, but nothing more. And so this trusting him is a mistake. Then when the civilian government came in, there was an assumption that the civilians will be strong enough to control the ISI, which was never the fact. The ISI was more powerful than the civilian government was. So even if the president and the prime minister wanted to do something about it, they weren't going to do about it. It was the American, and especially sort of American diplomats' unwillingness to face the fact that it's no longer our ally. It's like, I remember Cameron Munter, who was ambassador in Pakistan while I was a US ambassador here, we used to joke. He said, you want a divorce between Pakistan and the US? I said, no, all I'm saying is, hey, they're not sleeping together. They're not doing things together. She's cheating on you. Now you're virtually separated. You don't want to call it a divorce, fine, but this illusion, that's why I titled my book on US-Pakistan relations, Magnificent Delusions, because I think that the Americans were totally deluded in insisting on calling Pakistan a major non-NATO ally, et cetera, at a time when Pakistan's own policy priorities were totally divergent from America's policy priorities.
Okay, clearer. Governor Gilmore?
A few years ago, I led a Pakistani American business group to Pakistan, and I was the former governor. I wasn't the governor, and I was treated like a head of state. I was treated wonderfully over there and visited probably 15 cabinet ministers. But one of the questions I remember probing them on, I asked one of the cabinet ministers, I said, what is this obsession with Afghanistan and the United States presence in Afghanistan? Why do you care? And their response was very rational. They said, we have to have the ability to retreat if we're invaded by the Indians. Now, I thought that was a little crazy because I didn't think the Indians wanted to invade Pakistan. But then I probed further and I found that a lot of people in Pakistan think that's exactly what the Indians want to do. So they're protecting themselves in their rear, and they're very suspicious of anybody that goes over into Afghanistan and might deny them that ability to do that. That was what I took out of that. My question to you is this, though. If, to follow up on Ambassador Sedgwick, if the radical Islamists become getting control of Pakistan and therefore in control of that nuclear arsenal, what will the Indians do? They're already nervous about this and about their big Muslim population in India, which is very large, and the stability of India because of that. What happens if that occurs and these people that you've been talking about in your lecture all of a sudden are nuclear armed? What are the Indians liable to do?
So, Dr. Gilmore, let me begin by first addressing the first comment you made about the hospitality. Actually, if you read my book on US-Pakistan relations, I call it the Pakistan Playbook, which was because Pakistan is a new country. There was no Pakistan in history. In fact, the name Pakistan is actually an acronym, believe it or not, of the made up of the first letters of the regions that now constitute Pakistan. So it's an ongoing project of creating a national identity, and in that national identity, the threat of India plays an important role. And so and winning over Americans with sweet, quote unquote, sweet words. Actually, it's an exact quote from a letter exchange between Pakistan's first ambassador to the US and the founder of Pakistan. Sweet words and hospitality. So not only you, all other former governors need to be aware of this. They're always going to be nice. And by the way, we are a nice people. I mean, I was born in Pakistan, I'm a Pakistani by birth. So we are a nice people, we are hospitable, etc. But that disproportionate hospitality blinds people. For example, when you think about it, have you looked at the terrain between Pakistan and Afghanistan? How is the Pakistan army ever going to retreat into Afghanistan? It's just something they say to you to sort of make you think, okay, these guys do have some logic. There's no logic to it. It's actually it's an ideological project. The fear has always been that the northwest of Pakistan has the same ethnicity, the same culture, and the same language as Afghanistan. And the rest of Pakistan does not. And so the fear is always, what if they join them rather than us at some future point? So therefore, instead of that happening, we need to have greater influence in Afghanistan. I used to always say that if Pakistan wants a friendly government in Afghanistan, we should make friends with the government in Afghanistan. Why do we have to impose somebody there? And the Taliban are the most obscurantist and a small minority of Afghan Pashtuns, but Pakistan has continued to support them. As far as India is concerned, I have gone over this in great detail. I mean, I've served 4 Pakistani civilian prime ministers. I have reached the conclusion that Pakistan's deep state does not want to solve problems with India. It actually wants the problems with India as a way of being able to maintain control and power. And we know many other instances where this happens. For example, North Korea doesn't want to solve problems because essentially they are the justifier for its power, the power of the power elite, of the Korean Workers' Party or whatever it is. And so and with nuclear weapons, Pakistan has absolute security. Very frankly, India is not going to attack Pakistan when Pakistan has nuclear weapons. Pakistan knows that. Everybody in the world knows that. India knows that. Pakistan's military has always thought that they can control and manage radical Islamism in Pakistan. So in the last 2 days, they have signed 2 different agreements with 2 different radical groups. One group that was demanding the expulsion of the French ambassador over the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, which by the way are quite old now, and anywhere else would have been forgotten by now, but there is a movement there based exclusively on that. And then there's the other group, that is the Pakistani Taliban group. Now, what is the reality of Look, Pakistan has not been doing well economically. Pakistan, at the time of partition, what is today India, what is today Pakistan, they had more or less similar literacy rates. India's was about 2% higher than Pakistan. Now India's literacy rate is sort of in the 70% and Pakistan is still in the 50%. 20 million children of school-going age do not go to school in Pakistan. Any kind of school. And then there's a lot of several million who go to madrasas, which doesn't impart any other skill on them except some knowledge of religion like the Taliban have. So therefore, there is the specter of economic failure. There's the specter of political sort of upheaval, and in a situation like that, but then there is also a very good professional class, which is the one that interacts with you and people and probably took you there. Question is, can these people keep control while the pressure is building from below in favor of more and more and more Islamism? The Pakistani elite has so far done a good job of doing a juggling act. So Pakistan keeps making laws. You must be familiar with the blasphemy laws Pakistan has, which are the world's toughest and most difficult. So every now and then a new law is made to quote unquote Islamize Pakistan. But what happens when at some point the radical Islamists are able to convince the vast majority of the people and maybe some elements of the soldierly class that, hey, you know, this little dribs and drabs of Islamization is not what we need. We need a total revolution. In a situation like that, the risks for India, which already has memory of events like the Mumbai attacks, it will definitely increase. And what would they do? I think that they will have to, they will work on a containment strategy of the kind that the Arab nations have had in relation to Iran, which had a similar revolutionary upheaval, except Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons and Pakistan does. Therefore, Pakistan becomes a greater concern for the world's powers, including the United States.
Well, Ambassador Haqqani, thank you very much for a brilliantly insightful presentation.